Okay, so in a moment, I'm going to hand around these little folders. There's only a few, but what's going to happen today is during Johanna's talk, we're going to invite you to think about what questions you might have. So Johanna will speak to us and then we'll have a bit of an opportunity for a Q&A. So I encourage you to, as you're listening, think about what hasn't she said that you'd really like to know about, or a question you'd like her to respond to. Really excited about Johanna's topic this afternoon. You can see it up there on the board. Pattern recognition, a gift of living in the borderlands. A question for you to think about: do you recognise in your own space silos or narrow focuses? I've certainly seen that. I'm a high school teacher by trade, and certainly seen that as people in their disciplines hang on to and prioritise their own discipline as a very, very important way of seeing the world. And often hang on to that discipline so strongly that they lose focus maybe of what's needed for the young people. And my sister, she lectures in nutrition and dietetics at Sunshine Coast Uni, and I've heard her also lament this very narrow focus of disciplines, where in the academy it's all about knowing something or knowing a lot about a small little place. And the disciplines don't talk to each other. They don't allow that diversity, the big picture maybe, to inform the discussions or to inform their way of thinking about the world. So I'm really excited for Johanna to speak to us this afternoon, both about how her story has formed her way of seeing the world. And if you read the intro, you would see there was obviously struggle and pain along the way, as she saw that there wasn't necessarily the right place for her, or she didn't quite belong anywhere. But this place, this borderland place, has given her a gift, a way of seeing the world, and particularly of seeing us as human beings as whole people. I want to read a little quote for you from one of the pieces that you can find on her website, which is drjohannalynch.com if you're looking for it. She says, "Science has made a monumental historical mistake when it separated the mind and the body for study." I found that interesting because some of us may have also experienced that in the church too, where maybe flesh and spirit, or mind and body, has been separated out. And yet maybe there's a gift here today too in that space to think about how we're whole people. And certainly for me in my 40s, I'm discovering I am a body, and it's pretty exciting stuff. When I pay attention to my body, it tells me very interesting things. Really interesting. And I'm definitely a mind person. I love my brain, probably too much sometimes. So looking forward to what Johanna shares with us today. So I'm going to welcome Johanna to come and share with us. There's 5 little folders that are going to float around, and yeah, we'll have an opportunity for you to write some questions down. Maybe if you've got a question, write it down, pass the folder along so that we can gather those at the end. Welcome, Johanna.
Is that in the right? Thank you. Thank you. First of all, I'd just like to thank Theology on Tap for inviting me. I have a lot of respect for the people who are behind the scenes at Theology on Tap, so it's a privilege for me to be here. I'd also like to honour one of my first GP teachers, who's one of your team, that's Dr Paul Mercer, and some of my medical student friends and GP colleagues and old friends, and my dad and my husband who are here with us as well. And I noticed my spiritual director who's helped me along this way as well. And I'd also like to pay respects to the Indigenous elders and leaders who've walked on this land long before any of us were here, have held it and are teaching me and have influenced part of what I'll be bringing to you today. I hope by the end of this I will have inspired you a little bit to love patterns, and I hope that I'll also have given something to those of you who are wrestling with how things fit together and how those of us who span boundaries between science and the social sciences, between the kind of ephemeral and aesthetic and the spiritual in our lives, between our bodies, between our pasts and our futures, and of course across generations. I thought I'd start with telling you a little bit about the patterns that I love, and I've put some of them up the front here, some that I've made as a quilter, some that I've collected like a bowerbird from across the world, from Spain and India and other textiles and other imaginers around patterns. And so feel free to come and have a look at those at the end. I thought I'd start by mentioning the patterns that nobody else knows about, that you can only know about if you have a microscope or a telescope. The kind of patterns that you wouldn't, they're like secret surprises for all of us to know about. And this is one that's just a plant cross-section. And of course I've never actually seen a snowflake under a microscope. I wish I would. Well, it's one of my wish list things for my lifetime. This is a cross-section of a lime tree, apparently. And then there's patterns that are just exuberantly almost too much. We don't need them. Bees don't need to have 1,000 million different types of flowers to collect their pollen. But instead, we have these extravagant patterns that are in all sorts of ways and to help bees find their way, but to give us pleasure, I think, as well. And I'm bringing you to some patterns from places I've been where humans tell patterns across the generations through things they make. So these are mosaics from one of the most amazing churches I've ever been to, built in the 400s in Ravenna, and still there, still looking beautiful because they've been made out of mosaic. And here's a church that was a mosque, that was a church that was a mosque in Cordoba, that again has this amazing symmetry and ways that human beings put things together. And as a teenager, I got to go to St. Mark's and got completely fascinated by the floor in St. Mark's Cathedral in Venice, wanting to capture in little pieces of watercolour what others have put there centuries before. Patterns do something for me that help me feel like the world has some kind of deep order. They reassure me, they settle me, and I'm wondering if they might do the same to you. They also intrigue me, and I find them amazing. The fact that this pattern, which some of my medical colleagues would understand, is the electrics of the heart, is the same across all generations and continents. This is what the heart does when it's captured as an electrical symbol. And maths, isn't maths amazing? Equations that do things and make patterns and help us know the world. And I see the same in music. Thank you, Franz, that harmonies and the ways things match together like that. I feel that they help me to trust that there's some kind of deep order in the universe when we get a harmony that works. And I especially like patterns that are about movement. Here we've got the waves. I know some of you might like the pattern of a surfing wave that's good to surf on, or the tide that reliably comes in and out. And for me, the sunrise that comes every day is another pattern that we can rely on. I've had the privilege of also seeing this pattern. This is the wildebeest moving across East Africa. And I think of it like they're stepping out into the unknown. Each generation doesn't know where they're going as they head off to find pastures to the north or the south. And near us at Moreton Bay, we have shorebirds. Oops, gone the wrong way. Shorebirds that make it to Siberia and back, which I still find kind of amazing, seeing how tiny they are. And also my family and those who know me closely know I love to be part of the humpback migration and watch them moving from Antarctica to somewhere warmer reliably every year at the same time of year. And then there are patterns between human beings that are just amazing. Here's one that never fails to work. Yeah, that one human being smiling to another when there's trust. produces a reaction inside our bodies, even just watching these ones. An apology between human beings is an invitation for something different to happen. Humility between human beings. I wrote a little list so I didn't forget. Generosity between human beings is a pattern that happens between us. The soothing sound of our voices next to somebody else's body does something reliable. And that feeling of being home or of kindness, they're patterns that we can watch for around us in our world. Yeah? I'm wondering if you could think right now what your favourite pattern is. Or might give you a chance to think that through at the end too. Then in my study, I've been fascinated by patterns like this one, the recovery movement, which are patients who survive mental health illness talk about the things that help them to recover, talk about shifting from feeling a passive sense of themselves to an active sense of themselves, shifting from feeling disconnected from their community to connected to their community, and hopeless to hopeful. And those who write about trauma talk about post-traumatic growth, the things that can happen to someone after they've experienced trauma, where they know they're stronger than they thought they were. They know who to trust in their inner circle because of those who stuck with them, and they make meaning of the world as it really is, not as they wished it was. One of the leaders in thinking about trauma-informed practice in the world, Bessel van der Kolk, says this pattern is something he's seen. If you feel safe and loved, your brain becomes specialized in exploration, play, and cooperation. If you're frightened and unwanted, it specializes in managing feelings of fear and abandonment. This is a pattern that's in the medical literature called allostatic load, which is connecting how biology is impacted by stresses of all kinds. So allostasis is when the body can no longer get itself back to homeostasis, to balance, and it has to adapt in some way. And the stress can be from something physical, like infection or some other disease, or it can be from psychological stress. And so the body reacts and responds to that over time. This is the center of our thinking about how life stresses impact physiological disease. We know that people who've had multiple adverse childhood experiences have a reduced life expectancy. They have increased rates of cancer, autoimmune diseases, cardiac death, and stroke. And so this has become the place I sit in my work as somebody who's worked with trauma in practice, in general practice, and then seeing its impact on the body and wanting GPs to see this pattern earlier has been the impetus behind my work. I now bring you to a little bit of my story, and this is a picture with my dad as a much younger man in 1975, and my mum and my little brother and myself, age 7, arriving in Townsville after Dad had flown us for 40 days from East Africa to emigrate to Australia, leaving Idi Amin's Uganda behind. And this began a new life for our family in Townsville. And then Dad got homesick, so we went back to Kenya. And so I ended up doing grade 8 in Kenya, in Charters Towers, and in Indonesia, where Dad got work in my teens. And came to Australia again for university at UQ. And after university, I did some travel, some work overseas, but became a GP. And again, discovered this place that was very similar to my migrant childhood of being not quite fitting into the medical structures, the silos, the ways that medicine decided what was valuable, and searching for that place beside my patients where I could be with them in a system that seemed to divide them up. And that led me on to my research, which became transdisciplinary. So transdisciplinary research is trying to gather together the disciplines, which means that you're not in the middle of any single one of them. And a bit like GPs, we talk about ourselves as being masters of all trades, in a way. I say jack of all trades, masters of putting them together is our role. And in my work in research, I discovered there were some blocks to seeing the whole person that I hadn't realised were part of the story. So in my work in general practice, I was seeing a number of people cycling in and out of the mental health system, and nobody had listened to their stories, to their relationships, to the history of their lives, some of them very traumatizing. And there seemed to be no place to fit them inside the categories that psychiatry had created for distress. And I, with them, was lost at times. They taught me much of what I know. I didn't realise that behind that was a kind of bias against seeing knowledge that wasn't capital E evidence, that you could observe from outside, that was repeatable, objective, seen by what some would call a disembodied observer who was not influenced or biased in any way, and repeatable knowledge that could be tested and measured is highly valued in the academy, and that then promotes us having silos where we establish that knowledge. So if we have objective knowledge, we inherently bias against noticing subjective inner experience, perception, and meaning. If we have reduced things to study them so we can be sure we're studying the right thing, which often in science means excluding the very sick who've got multiple diseases that might influence your science, which in general practice means excluding most of our patients from the study. So we then miss complex, interconnected, homeostatic and regulatory things that are part of what's going on. And if we take away context, we miss relationships, social context, environment, meaning, and other confounding variables, as they'd be called. And when we're looking for evidence that's an objective measure, we'll often be looking for something that's an object. And that means we're not watching for things that move. And some would say this is a little history lesson around how we look for diseases, that we started looking at corpses to try and work out what was going on with disease. And so we've had a bias within medicine for looking at the organ like a fixed object that doesn't move. And that inherently means we miss processes that are happening in the body in systems like the immune system, the stress response system, and also, I would say, spirit and meaning systems, relationship systems that are happening for that person. And then this kind of science is dualist. It divides the mind and the body as though they're things. And I find myself saying over and over now, what's a mental? If you've got a mental illness, what's a mental? Because how do we divide a person up like that? Yeah. I sometimes teach this to medical students with the idea of Humpty Dumpty being broken into parts. And one part of him is studied in the biomedical sciences, which are looking for objective, reproducible, observed knowledge that's got linear logic and deduces things as the way it does reason. And the other part of Humpty is being studied in the social sciences faculty, where we highly value meaning and relationships and senses and complexity and environment, context. And we use sense-making and we value authenticity as ways we understand what's true. And we use a different kind of logic in that part of the sciences. As a GP, I can see those two, but I'm still stuck because with the patient, neither of those is okay on their own. If I come to them with only a biomedical point of view, I've missed something. If I go with only a social sciences point of view, I've missed something. And so that led me to looking at transdisciplinarity. And transdisciplinarity as a philosophy has come from quantum physics, which says you can have both light as a particle and a wave. So you can tolerate two different types of knowing at the same time. And they highly value religious and aesthetic ways of understanding metaphor as ways to link these two types of knowing. And so this is a place where pattern recognition sits. Pattern recognition can cross the boundaries between these two different types of knowledge. And it can be something you learn, you become more and more experienced at. In fact, I've just written a paper called The Craft of Generalism, saying that you can become more experienced at this craft, more skilled at understanding how to see patterns. If we look at it as a pattern between these two things, the social sciences would see something as complex, the biomedical sciences would see them as reductionist. The social sciences would see them as contextualized, and the biomedical would see them as decontextualized in order to get to capital E evidence. And so we go around this cycle, that they're beautifully complementary, but somebody has to hold them together. I recently gave a talk at the Australian Academic Association for Primary Care Research using this metaphor. What if we thought of humans like a tree, and the leaves are all these little details that we can measure, like a blood test result or a symptom somebody's described. Sometimes they'll be so defined, like anemia, we've got a name for what they look like, and they are something we can measure in that biomedical space. And what if the roots were like how we're connected to our environment? And under the ground, I've been learning about trees, how they talk to each other and touch each other and give each other nutrients under the ground. And so those roots are touching their neighbour and communicating them through culture, through touch, through the relationships, through our history. But between the leaves and the roots, there's a trunk. And the trunk's actually sort of the boringest bit, but deep inside it's got hidden things that some of us don't even know are in there when we look at a tree. The sap that connects them is the dynamics that take things from the roots and put them into the leaves. And so I think there's a special skill for noticing those dynamics. When I finished this talk, I had a picture of somebody hugging a tree trunk, because that's the place where I think love sits, where meaning and spirit, but also very practical things like the immune system, the stress response system, the endocrine system of our physiology that helps the tree know, that expresses itself through the leaves. Unfortunately, when we have reductionist ways of knowing, we can become fixated on the leaves. And if we've misnamed one of those leaves, which I think we have with the term depression or the term anxiety, we then become very fixated on struggling to find solutions for the leaves without noticing the rest of the tree and their roots and the ground that they're in. So for GPs, we're often in the ground too. Our roots are sometimes connected to the trees of our patients that are in the same earth that we're in. And so this is quite important for GPs to validate the skills they use that are about people. So I ask these questions, can we transcend the barriers between knowledge cultures for the sake of whole person care? And if we think of me as a migrant who's cross cultures, who's spoken with the wrong accent in almost 3 continents, because I learnt it as I went and changed it, that there's this place, this skill set that is about not belonging to any of the silos. Yeah, and I want to encourage you, if any of you have a not belonging feeling, that maybe it's because you're sitting somewhere that's liminal, that can change things because you can see something that others can't see when you're right in the middle. If we're only in the leaves or only in the roots, we miss something in the middle. We know that illness is an integral experience. It can only be artificially divided into biological, psychological, social, and spiritual dimensions. We just do that to study it. If we don't learn how to put it back together, we're doing a disservice to our community. If we tell our community that what we have is the best evidence, but we haven't done the job of bringing Humpty Dumpty back together again, then we've sold our community something that's not true about being human. And I guess for all of us, if we learn ourselves to watch patterns better and to value them and see them as a unique skill set, they can be something that protect you against the silos that come around us. Abraham Maslow has become somebody I highly value in my research, and you'll understand why in a moment. And he talks about enlarging our concept of objectivity to include not only spectator knowledge of the person, what he calls uninvolved knowledge or knowledge about or knowledge from the outside of someone, but also experiential knowledge, which captures that knowing about meaning, knowing about relationships, knowing about senses and subjective experience, what he calls love knowledge. So my PhD was entitled Sense of Safety, a Whole Person Approach to Distress. And this is because inside the transdisciplinary way of seeing, shared language really matters. And so I sought to see if the word sense of safety could be something that would be applicable in the immune silo and in the social sciences relational silo and in the stress sort of endocrine world, and of course in those who understand about disease. And I asked my stakeholders, which included Indigenous academics, GPs, multidisciplinary mental health clinicians and patients, if they could answer these 3 questions, and I then analysed what they said. What causes threat? How do people sense that they are safe? And what does the phrase sense of safety mean to you? And alongside that, I then searched the literature for the word sense of safety or for the meaning of sense of safety. So the built environment literature already used the term sense of safety to mean places where people live, where they have solidarity with their neighbours and there are green spaces around them. The immune literature already used the word sense of danger to mean a skill that the immune system has to identify danger as it enters our body to mount an immune response. So when we asked what does sense of safety mean to you, people described a whole person experience. They talked about themselves and the people they were near or people they had in their lives that they felt were supportive and their environment. They talked about the dynamics of do I feel supported by the people near me and do I feel capable to engage my world? And those were the parts of the story that some also mentioned watching other people interact with their world as the way they felt safe. But all of them did an integrative thing where they decided whether or not they had a sense of safety or they didn't have a sense of safety. And so the clue was perhaps this is a language that we can use to help people do that bringing together of Humpty Dumpty themselves. That if they notice their own sense of safety and they get skilled at doing that and the clinicians around them get skilled at noticing it, maybe we'll be doing something that helps the whole. We also mapped what people said caused threat and named the things that help us to feel safe. Things where we feel we have integrity, where we have coherence, and when we have connection, they build our sense of safety. And in situations where we lose sense of safety, we are getting invaded, our integrity is getting invaded in some way. That can be through violation that's physical, but it also can be violation that's about expectations or demands or coercion and traps. And we get loss of sense of safety if we get confusion. And those who work in the domestic violence sphere, we talk about gaslighting or ways that people lose their nerve to monitor their own intuition because they're getting confused. And then we have a loss of sense of safety if our connection is lost. And so this helps us to pick up things that are sometimes missed when we only look for violation, like abandonment and disconnection, turning away that happens, silent treatment, and there's now brain studies looking at what we call non-verbal emotional abuse, which is the silent treatment and how it influences the structure and function of the brain. Those who work in Canadian psych hospitals say that sense of safety is what they start to look for. They call it felt security. And they say that sometimes feeling secure is more important to people than being healthy. And this helps us to understand resistance, what we would see as resistance to taking on health messages in our community, because something else is helping us feel safe that's more important than the health message we're communicating. Then if we look at this overall, there's a sense of our whole person domains that are the kind of breadth of what we need to look at. So we look at what people said about threat and match them according to how broadly somebody who's caring for somebody's level of threat needs to look. So this applies to somebody who's a teacher, it applies to someone who's a boss, it applies to someone who's trying to work in a team, and of course it applies to people who are clinicians. Oops, I've gone back. Somehow it's gone to, sometimes it forwards. So this idea that we're looking for environment, and interestingly, when people talked about what causes threat, they spoke a lot about injustice, making them feel threat. Racism, environmental scarcity, lack of access to things they needed. When we look at social climate, we're intentionally naming some things that sometimes get missed, like the atmosphere in a child's family and extended family, not necessarily their personal relationships, that resort to violence or gambling, or there's an experience of poverty in that space, but also the atmosphere that's happening in their social media feed can be threatening, acutely threatening. In relationships, we're really interested in who's there and what they're doing and what it feels like to be in relationship with that person, including who's missing in the relationship space. In the body, we're interested in regulation, how well we're sleeping, and our day-to-day functions around appetite, but we're also interested in emotion as a bodily experience that's telling us what something's going on around us. So emotion not as something that's stuck in our mind like a thought that you can just change your mind about. Emotion is something that's physiologically encoded, that's distressing us. And then we look at our inner experiences, which are not just thoughts. And because thoughts are easy to measure, we can ask people to tell them to us. They've become dominant in the way that we do healing. Yeah? Instead, what about our dreams? What about our visions, our memories, our nightmares, our senses, our perceptions, what we pay attention to? All of those things have been written out of the story because they're much more difficult to measure. Then we have sense of self, and that we talk about how we communicate to ourselves and our attitude towards ourselves. And this is a key area which is not part of the way we think about the psyche at all. It's not in any of the DSM measures other than to say people feel unworthy or empty in some of them. But in here it can be a place of unity, it can be a place of creativity, kindness, clarity, and so that's a deep place that we can do work in terms of people's healing. It can also be a place of loathing and hatred and disconnection and minimizing and ignoring as well. And then we have meaning and spirit. Those who work with grief talk about meaning making as a key way that healing happens. Those who have a spiritual way of seeing the world, it can cause harm or good in that space. People can feel punished and disconnected, dislocated, and disconnected from God in the way they see the world, or they can experience it as a place of peace and refuge and a place they take their regrets. Maslow has this hierarchy where he thinks we need to be safe in our physiology, and then we can feel safe in our environment and in our connection to others in love and belonging needs, our esteem needs, and then we can self-actualize. But there's been critique of his pyramid because some people who are starving can do the most amazing kindnesses to other people, and so this is not a kind of linear story. So I've reframed his way of seeing it and added the idea that our bodies need to be central. A calm body is part of how we feel safe. And often when we think a lot about the thoughts, trying to change people's thoughts or even people's beliefs, we've ignored the body and how aroused and distressed and confounded it is, how confused and alarmed it is. So this idea that we want people to feel safe on the inside in how they experience their inner experiences and their sense of self. We want people to feel safe enough to grow. So safety is not just a mollycoddled space, it's a place where you feel safe enough to go out and explore and take appropriate risks. We also want to safe enough to belong with the people around us. And sometimes, even when there's people who love us, if our bodies are aroused, we can't feel it. Sometimes when we want to notice something spiritual, if our bodies are aroused, we can't sense it. And then, of course, what we want our environments to be safe places. This idea of movement has been something that I wanted to build into the idea of sense of safety. So it's not just about mapping where the problems are or where the strengths are in someone's lives. It's also about watching the dynamics and making sure that they're building a sense of safety. And so by mapping what people said helped them to feel safe and what people said threatened them, these are the 5 dynamics that came out. The first one's broad awareness. So again, it's about not siloing the way we see threat. Threat makes us narrow our view. Broad awareness widens it. And it's part of how we stay safe, to keep things in perspective, to be aware of ourselves and other people and the wider world, not just the problem we're looking at. Respectful connection to ourselves, to other people and to our environment are part of building a sense of safety. Calm sense-making is that piece where we connect ourselves to ourselves And we build our understanding of what do my emotions mean, what does my own story mean, and that wider story of how do I fit in my community. And communities do this through rituals, they do it through dialogue with one another. Capable engagement is that sense I can engage with my world, and my world is encouraging me to feel I'm capable. And then owning ourselves, that's that piece of owning my decisions, owning my understanding of myself, owning how I interact with the world. And that's come directly from a patient's description of what sense of safety was to them. Sense of safety is owning myself and my experiences. Last thing to want to share with you is, as I was going through towards the end of my thesis, I discovered that the root word for safety also means whole. This is an ancient word that has all these other words hidden inside it: solus, soluba, solidus, and salvus, but solvus means whole. And so I saw this as a way of encouraging me to think this piece of work where we're trying to help human beings feel safe in their bodies, in themselves, in how they connect to other people and their environment is part of what helps us to feel whole. And I end with 2 verses. One of them is the one reminding us that when we have safety, we can step out from a fortress. We have a fortress we can step out from. Whoever dwells in the shelter of the Most High will rest in the shadow of the Almighty. I will say of the Lord, He is my refuge and my fortress, my God in whom I trust. And the second verse is one in honour of my mum, because this is the one that helped her feel safe to travel the 40 days to get here. And this is, have mercy on me, O God, have mercy on me, for in you my soul takes refuge. I will take refuge in the shadow of your wings until the disaster has passed. Thank you.